and welcome, if you will, to the pilot episode, the soft opening of a brand new show being offered on the Coalition Radio Network. Well, we're going to call it, for now, the Washington Outsider Report. Going forward, this will be run by, if you will, it'll be programmed by, it'll be engaged with someone that I've had the great pleasure over the last month or so of getting to know. Her name, of course, is Irina Zuckerman. She is truly a Renaissance woman, a graduate of Fordham University Law School, an international security lawyer, a security consultant. She operates a publication, if you will, online called the Washington Outsider, while at the same time running an organization called Scarab Rising, if I have that correct.
Correct.
We are going to cover, and actually I should say she is, because she is truly a subject matter expert on the politics, the economics, the rascals, the incredible nuance and complexity of both Southwest Asian, Middle Eastern, and Northern African politics. I got to know Irina in the, we had her on a month or so ago, and we talked extensively for an hour about the Yemeni civil war. And she was able to offer us in an hour or so a completely different worldview, a highly documented yet highly accessible presentation on, again, what is a complex situation. And here's the issue in geopolitics. None of this is straightforward and requires a level of knowledge and introspection that can only be provided by someone who engages with virtually every aspect of a situation, and there are many. Just to name a few, we're going to be talking about North African geopolitics. We're going to be talking about, tonight in particular, we're going to spend some time, obviously, on Afghanistan. We're going to look to have folks in to talk about a variety of Iranian, I don't know if I call them civil wars, but internal conflicts that are going on that are seemingly ignored by the Western media. And so what we're going to hope to do is leverage Ms. Zuckerman's vast experience, contacts, and information about these issues and present a much more complex, more well-rounded presentation of really what's going on. And I'm talking about boots on the ground. I've followed your travels, Irina, over the last month or so, and I'm exhausted just watching it. I mean, you are on the ground in virtually every part of the region, and you have resources and contacts virtually on every part of the region. One simple show that we did, which she was kind enough to retweet, brought to me folks from literally all of the regions I described in terms of following the coalition. It was amazing to watch, and those folks had such a generosity of spirit in providing me with a eye-opening amount of information on regions and issues that I had no idea about. And I say that because it's almost cliche in the United States to point to our media and complain, and to talk about how certain foreign media seems to have completely different perspectives and a completely different fact set and a completely different worldview, and why is ours so different, and all of that. And so what we're going to try to do, and what Ms. Zuckerman's going to try to do, and it's her show after this. I'm handing over the keys. Free reign. Anyone who knows me knows that we don't edit. We don't. Free reign. I'm hoping to learn as much as I hope all of you will learn about what all of this means in the picture that's presented to us, this sort of nicely edited, no sharp edges, no debate presentation brought to you by your Department of State, your Department of Defense, and a variety of major newspapers and publications who quite honestly focus on their perspective. Irina, do you think that's a good run up to what we're going to try to do here?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm actually kind of excited to disrupt this this euphemistic worldview of that creates excuses for everything and better words and ends up being sort of Orwellian by
Hmm.
trying to be too nice.
Right. I've often complained both on the local governmental level and on the bigger picture that stop infantilizing, if you will, the American people, which is a nice way of saying stop talking to us like we're children and we can't handle the truth. Because what that has bred here in the United States is a monster, and that monster is a complete denial of any other perspective other than what's being presented to them by their favorite leader du jour. And as a result, a surface level, almost cliched analysis of events that does not attack the complexity of the actual situation. And as a result, when we look at the flawed decisions of those that we elect, and sometimes those who are self appointed, we wonder why we have tragedy like we do this week. And when I talk about tragedy, I'm not just talking about the 13 brave men and women who served in our nation's military who died, quite frankly, unnecessarily. I'm not just talking about if you will, a series of events that took a military demobilization and turned it into a chaotic evacuation. I'm not just talking about our continued decisions to nation build in parts of the world which may or may not be interested in us nation building them. I'm talking about all of that. We can't interpret our decisions of our leaders if we don't know all the facts. And as a result, we all know at this point in time in American history that voting has consequences. How can we vote and continue to support them if we don't open our eyes to a wider range of facts and knowledge and perspective from around the world? It's an incredibly complex situation, but in one sense, it really is that simple, isn't it, Irina?
You know, I take issue with the word nation building when it comes to Afghanistan simply because it's both what what the US tried to do with both too much and too little at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The analogy I would use for why I think even trying to reduce this complicated situation to that combination of words is as if the US had decided that New York and California are the sole states worth investing in all infrastructure, energy, education, media, and so forth, while disregarding Kentucky, Iowa, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
This is the situation with what happened in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. There was a great deal of well organized logistical involvement on certain issues. There's been an attempt to educate women, to integrate women, to create government institutions. There's been largely no engagement with the vast majority of the country, and that has allowed extremists to proliferate. While the U.S. Overspent money and resources on issues that could have been at least partially handled with somewhat more efficiency by private actors. It has created unnecessary costs and incentives for people to prolong the situation and not to look for the most efficient ways of handling challenges and addressing objectives. And worst of all, there was no clear goal in mind. There were abstract notions. There was no clear um, goals, measurables to measure success or failure of what we were doing. And when there's no measurements of success, there's no accountability, and you never get to where you want to be, no matter how laudable the cause or the goal. That was my biggest problem with the past 20 years. Not the fact that we were trying to help people improve their country. We are involved around the world in many different ways, and not all of them are failures. Many of them are great successes. But Afghanistan was by and large a failure because we never had a clear idea of what success would actually mean.
Interestingly enough, Rhode Island, this tiny little state here in the United States, for those who might listen in the coming days and aren't as familiar with, and by the way, it's a unique conceit amongst Americans that I would assume that anybody who might listen to this in Afghanistan or Iran or Morocco would know where Rhode Island is. You might have heard of Newport, Rhode Island, only because it's, lifestyles of the rich and famous. But again, let's assume that no one's ever heard of Rhode Island out in the greater world. By sheer coincidence, in the United States Senate, which accords 2 senators to every American state, one of those 2 senators, and the senior senator for the state of Rhode Island, is a gentleman by the name of Jack Reed. And he is the senator in charge, if you will, of something called the Armed Services Committee. And by definition, is arguably one of the 4 or 5 most powerful people in American government, and has, with the Foreign Armed Services Committee, has this incredible power both in establishing the defense budget and has a major voice in decisions surrounding American geopolitics, particularly as a Democrat with a Democratic president in place. His military education is of the highest level. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, more commonly known as West Point, and had considerable experience as an active duty military member, and then now as one of the senior senators in the United States Senate. That being the, if you will, the upper of the 2 houses, and for whom foreign policy is a major conceit. I had the and because he's a Rhode Island senator, it's almost folksy. He comes home a bunch of times a year, and he shows up at, in one case it was the opening literally of a new bus station. And there standing in front of me was this powerhouse, maybe one of the more powerful people. If you were to take the top 100 powerful people in the world, he might break into that top 100. And there he is standing in front of me. And I had to ask him at this event, I had to ask him about Haiti and American involvement in Haiti. That was the day, literally, of the assassination of the Haitian president. A few weeks later, I ran into him again, and I got to ask him about, the College of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, where it turns out, it appears that we trained 2 of the assassins. And so I got to ask him about, well, is it still the current policy of the United States military to run the Future Assassins League? That went over as well as you can expect, Irina. But more importantly, in the wake of the chaos surrounding Afghanistan, I asked him about the Powell Doctrine, and you'd have to think back about 20 years. Colin Powell was an American general and one of the architects, if you will, of the first Gulf War. And the Powell Doctrine was invented, if you will, to make sure that we never had another Vietnam. And I someday in a different conversation, I'd love to talk with you about, say, for example, and I still call it the Soviet Union, but Russians' attitude about their Afghanistan war and whether they view it as we do, as we have this wounded spot in our nation's psyche about Vietnam. And under the Powell Doctrine, if the United States committed military forces, as they say here in the States, boots on the ground, quaint, right? Almost quaint. But if we had boots on the ground, there had to be a clear reason for us going, a clear goal, and then a clear exit strategy. Looking as you do at Afghanistan, not necessarily as an American, I mean, you are an American, but not as a, Bruce Springsteen clutching NFL loving American. Did we accomplish any of those goals other than at some level defeating Al Qaeda? And I say at some level very cautiously. And, of course, it's been purported that we assassinated the architect of the World Trade Center bombing. But did from your perspective, did we have a clear goal? Did we understand what it would take to do so? And did we, I dare say, did we have an exit strategy? What are your thoughts?
I would say none of the above. To be honest, I don't think um, killing off a few Al Qaeda leaders or eliminating a number of terror cells would ever put an organization of that sort to an end. We did have some limited success in disrupting resources, chains of supply, and so forth. But once again, it's a tactical success, it's not a strategic success. If your objective is to weaken a terrorist organization or any organization to the point of not being a problem, it takes a combination of factors. One of them most clearly ideological response, which we clearly did not engage in very well to prevent that from happening. It also means addressing external factors, contributions of state and other non-state actors to the financing and growth of that organization. So simply going in, clearing the area of known combatants did not really accomplish the mission of making sure that Al Qaeda would never be a threat to the United States again. And some people counter that by saying, well, in 20 years, we never had a major attack on the US soil. But is it due to our actions or is it due to Al Qaeda's own differing priorities, which could change at any moment? Is it because we've been so successful, or is it because Al Qaeda has decided to take a long view of the situation and to wait for a better opportunity to strike than what was then, immediately after a major and traumatic terrorist attack, which from their perspective was extremely successful on many levels. In terms of other goals, educating women is once again a laudable idea, but it's tactical, it's not strategic. If the strategic goal is to transform the society into a self-sustaining, functional state, it it takes a combination. It's a long-term goal. It can't happen overnight. We were never honest with ourselves about what it would take, how much investment. Um, we were never capitalized on the possibility of the private sector's ability to answer many of these questions more successfully than potentially corrupt semi-governmental processes. And we also did not allocate the resources efficiently, focusing almost exclusively on women from relatively liberal areas and ignoring the fact that the larger society was conservative and not engaged, which essentially actually put the women there in, if not in danger, it created an opportunity for Taliban to utilize those areas for hearts and minds campaigns among population that was skeptical of the US push among liberals without engaging with the conservative societies, communities, and local chieftains. The US missed an opportunity to use the society to help itself. Instead, it was essentially pulling one aspect of Afghanistan in one direction while the rest remained stagnant and in place. This was not efficient at all. Um, it also failed to build up real self-sustaining institutions, any sort of national psyche. Uh, it has allowed foreign actors such as ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency, which had its own geopolitical interest in Afghanistan, to uh, penetrate the society to such an extent that it has created corruptions and fifth columnists and made it extraordinarily difficult to for local families, tribes, communities not to be corrupted and to be engaged with the US without also playing double games with other regional actors. That was never really taken into account, reformed, or addressed in any way. That's just one of the many issues. Um, many people were profiting of the presence there, and so they did not really care about the result that much. That's the bottom line. And and there were no clear incentives for accomplishing the goals, because so long it became a presence for the sake of the process, not for the sake of accomplishing those objectives, however long they took and whatever it took. There was no incentive to even define them properly, because it was such a perfect opportunity for making money and for just going along to get along. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have been there, but we should have been there, but in a clearly defined way and with incentives to actually move forward rather than just stay in the same place. In terms of the exit strategy is not always about timelines as much as measurable results. But the problem is we did not have that either, and so when it came to withdrawing from Afghanistan, it was done on the timeline of other people, and 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 fitting with the objectives of other people, namely the Taliban, and used the supposed disaffection of the American public as an excuse. A very poor way to run foreign policy, frankly. There was no push to end the war the way there were mass demonstrations during the war in Iraq. Yes, people were tired, but U.S. losses were comparatively minimal. Of course, every loss of human life is a horrific tragedy. I don't want to undermine it, but in the grand scheme of things, this was not Vietnam by any stretch of the imagination, not comparable at all. And it kept, while it was not successful in accomplishing goals, it did keep some level of stability and prevented the extremists from proliferating and crossing certain red lines that they now have the access of doing. So unfortunately, the answer is, we made things worse when we had every opportunity to make them better, because from the very beginning there was no interest, or the process was co-opted and bankrupted in a way that made it impossible to ever succeed. If you don't have a goal, you'll never want to succeed.
Now, from your perspective, and let's go back in time, and of course, it's um, it's easy, here in the United States, and the they talk about Monday morning quarterbacking. Uh, the and that's a reference to whether it be the football game, whether it be a soccer match, how it should have been. But let's do that. From your experience, you had two separate wars rolled into one, if you will. You had Afghanistan, and you had Iraq. In the United States, I'm sure you've heard this term before. Afghanistan is often referred to as the good war. And what they mean by that is that we had a right to attack Al Qaeda based on their attack on us on 9/11. So that, in a sense, that's a consensus starting point by all Americans. Iraq was based on ultimately a series of lies, allegedly, about weapons of mass destruction that were allegedly in Iraq and aimed at us. What's your perspective on the notion of the good war versus a war that was, or a police action, or however you want to describe it, that was flawed from the get-go? In the wake of
I
9/11,
don't
what do you
believe.
think we should have done?
My view is a little bit less kind of idealistic with respect to these things, and a little bit more practical. I don't adhere to any particular theoretical school of thought. I adhere to what are the U.S. interests and security considerations in a matter. Have we met any particular, do the wars meet U.S. interests or not? And are there threats or issues that can be resolved through these actions that cannot be resolved in any other way? So Iraq, I will leave for a separate discussion, because it's a separate topic that I think deserves its own analysis. Afghanistan, the, the from the very beginning was almost an operation that turned into an endless war, because we never really admitted to ourselves what we were doing, who we were really targeting, and what we were facing.
Hmm.
George Bush called it the war on terror, which is a meaningless term. A terror is a tactic. It's not. It's not an enemy. Other tries to call it the war on Islam, an even more meaningless term, and quite frankly, just plain stupid and offensive in a way that's very counterproductive. No, some try to narrowly define it as a war on Al Qaeda, also not really plausible since then Al Qaeda spread all over the globe, and we are not pursuing Al Qaeda in every corner of the earth. Um, and it wasn't really a war; it was an operation. Um, Taliban was covering for Al Qaeda, so it was considered to be a legitimate target. But what were we actually trying to do? Were we expecting a capitulation, and if so, by whom? Were we were we expecting to limit ourselves to an elimination of particular targets, and if so, what would we do afterwards when those targets were replaced by somebody else? Was it all about Osama bin Laden? Was Osama bin Laden so irreplaceable that killing him off would have solved all our problems at that time and place? I don't think we have good answers or satisfying answers to those questions. I think every piece of evidence since in the last 20 years points to the opposite, that we either completely underestimated, for lack of experience, the kind of war we were actually fighting, and the fact that it was started not by us but by Al Qaeda, and the fact that we were merely responding and not really waging war, or that we just simply did there was sufficient knowledge to make that estimation, but essentially it was that effort was hijacked by various interests, and instead of doing what we really needed to do, people with those interests just gained control and did what they wanted to do regardless of consequences or what they knew was necessary. I don't know which one is actually true, whether it was simply a mistaken view of counterterrorism and counter extremism and what it means, or whether it was a corrupted process hijacked by people who knew better and deliberately deceived people for the last 20 years.
When should we? Well, first of all, do you contend we should have gone in the first place? Is it possible for a conventional war to defeat an organization like Al Qaeda?
I didn't think what we were doing was even considered could be called technically conventional war, because we ended up having to respond to terrorists and engage in strikes and engage in asymmetrical tactics during the course of what we were doing. I think what we were not prepared was that the new wars are all hybrid wars. They're never going to be quick and clean cut, because we're not dealing with state actors pursuing very narrow goals through conventional means. We're dealing with a combination of state and non-state actors pursuing different agendas through every possible means, and ignoring things like Geneva Conventions and international law and and traditional rules of engagement in the process. I don't think we had a good grasp of how that would work. Our military institutions are not set up to deal with asymmetrical warfare by non-state actors. If you look at the military versus criminal code, non-state actors, as there's a confusion of defining combatants who are non-state actors or terrorists
Mm-hmm.
versus combatants who are very uniform, adhere to rules of engagement, Geneva Conventions, and so forth. So we were from the very outset plagued by issues of having to adhere to legal and political notions that were somewhat outdated thanks to the emergence of new types of threats And law and rules of engagements always lag behind newly emerging threats. That's the problem. We were at a disadvantage from that perspective from the very beginning, from a military perspective. So that means that thinking ahead, we would have had to take into considerations that we weren't just fighting Al Qaeda or even Al Qaeda and Taliban. We were fighting their funders, collaborators, proxies, potential branches, anyone who was covering for them, fellow travelers, an entire coalition of various interests and methods that would be used against us at every opportunity.
If you look at the collapse that occurred, it's been contended by some American sources that over the last year or so, particularly after the Trump administration had quote unquote negotiated a settlement with Al Qaeda, with the Taliban, that
Same thing,
same thing.
practically.
So, and we'll touch on that for a little bit. You know, there's at least in the American media, there is often a differentiation between the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and now this new wing. Develop that thought for me.
Well, I'll give you an example for why some of these distinctions are kind of distinctions without a difference. Yes, those are separate entities with their own agendas. Taliban was a local Islamist movement. Al Qaeda is a global network. For instance, there are some theological distinctions, and Al Qaeda was developed by Arab leaders, whereas Taliban an Afghan ISI backed movement of mujahideen. There are all sorts of differences you could find, but ultimately, and they are important for understanding their function, their methodology, the way their structure of their organizations. On a counterterrorism level, they do play a tactical role, but in terms of the big picture, these are very close allies, and they don't necessarily make. There is a level of interconnection that's often hard to separate because members migrate from one group to another. Someone they recruit from each other. They sometimes work together, and there are all sorts of identities and affiliations that are not easily distinguishable. Right now, for instance, who is heads Taliban security now? The Haqqani network that's affiliated with Al Qaeda, and that's also backed by ISI. Who did Taliban liberate when the U.S. abandoned the Bagram base? They liberated Al Qaeda and ISIS-K members. ISIS-K is a branch of. Uh, they broke off from Al Qaeda back in the day. Al Qaeda tries to advertise itself as somewhat more moderate than ISIS and its affiliates, and ISIS. A lot of the ISIS people initially came from former Ba'ath members radicalized in Syrian prisons. But at the end of the day, um, these groups pursue various visions of the caliphate. They don't recognize national borders. They believe in political Islam, an idea of applying a highly selected and I would say, distorted version of Islamic texts and beliefs and haggis to a political system without separating between religion and the state in any way. So uh, they have may have different long-term goals in terms of each pursuing their own independent power or primacy in the future caliphate, but ultimately against Western interests, they are united. They unify. So in terms of threat assessment, they should not be regarded as completely at odds with each other.
Was it hopelessly naive then to think that we could negotiate with the Taliban as the opposition political force in Afghanistan with somehow the tacit understanding that they would, quote unquote, protect us from Al Qaeda?
It was beyond naive. It was at best willful blindness and possibly complete disregard for an obvious outcome. Taliban wished to have absolute power. It would not be ever entering into any power sharing agreement if it could at all help it, and if it did have to share power temporarily, it would work until it could oust everyone else and take power militarily if given that opportunity. Taliban was also very clear about its opposition to the West, to the US, to any sort of arrangement of that sort. And they're terrorists. They're not listed as the US as a terrorist organization, but that makes them no less terrorists. They share identical belief to other similarly situated groups, including Al Qaeda. They called themselves the Islamic Emirate. They gave the their leader is going to be called the Commander of the Faithful, failing to recognize the Moroccan king, who has the same title as a legitimate authority. So they're asserting a supranational authority to all so-called believers. We should have understood what we are really facing and been honest with the public and with ourselves. Instead, all of this was used as an excuse for politically expedient goals and just getting out of there and winning, scoring points about withdrawing from Afghanistan, putting an end to endless wars and so forth.
Right. Wow. So what are we left with now? Um, I'm reading a headline right now as we speak from that the deep thinkers at USA Today and their assessment of the Biden and Trump administration. The headline reads: Biden and Trump administration didn't miss ISIS-K threat; they ignored it. Experts say. Uh, is that consistent with what your thoughts are?
Well, I would say that it's nice of them to admit that ISIS was never fully dead, despite claims to the contrary by various other experts.
Right.
And but in reality, it was not the only threat that was willfully ignored. All of these threats were ignored, and ISIS-K is in no way better or worse than the Taliban. I think the subtext here is that Taliban is a more moderate and more familiar organization, and we can cut deals, and they're pragmatic, whereas ISIS are cutthroat radicals who will stop at nothing to get what they are. That's not realistic at all. We've been played, and Taliban and ISIS and everyone else have understood how the Western public thinks about these issues and manipulated these perceptions to create a rhetoric of various factions, some more moderate than others, kind of like what we're discussing when we're discussing the so-called reformists and hardliners in Iran. It's the same idea. Maybe Iran even helped them develop this understanding and this formulation of relative extremism, which is silly if you think about the word.
The other myth that's being perpetuated and perpetrated by certain forces within the American government is that we had no casualties for a year or so, that leaving the American Marine contingent and leaving American assets to the tune of about 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers would have kept a stable Afghanistan and would have prevented, if you will, the collapse as we saw it. Your thoughts on that?
Well, yes and no. So it what happened was a self-perpetuating cycle of destruction of something that could have been a reality. Had the administrations been keeping to what they claimed to the public and not deceptive and manipulative, um, that would have been the correct answer. That would have been true. These 2 or 3 thousand soldiers could have kept the peace. The reality is, however, that the administrations, in particular Biden, have undermined the conditions that made it possible for the country to be maintained at a stable point, but that contingent. They created a situation where it was no longer possible. First of all, negotiating with Taliban and especially cutting out The Afghan government sent them a signal, legitimized Taliban, and sent a subtle signal to the rest of the population that the U.S. was going in the direction of empowering Taliban and abandoning giving less support to everybody else.
Hmm.
As a, Essentially, it was a psychological warfare point for the Taliban that kind of undermined everything else and put us on a track towards losing, not just withdrawing on our terms because we felt that the situation had been stabilized, but actually losing without even with superior military capabilities. The second issue, of course, is that it's very likely that there were behind the scenes arrangements we're not currently aware of. Because if for the last year, there's been Taliban did not become militarily empowered overnight. The Pentagon deceived the public about their level of success for a reason, possibly to justify this withdrawal and to manipulate the information flow. But it has covered up the growth of Taliban presence and their relative uh, exposition of violence that grew over time.
Hmm.
That's just one of the examples. And that happened under Trump. It's been happening for a while. Under Biden, we saw a couple of episodes that showed us more than a couple. There was more going on that meets the eye. Biden had dismantled the crisis management bureau that would have been assisting in the evacuation efforts. Why would he do that? That makes no sense. Out of all the bureaus that are useless and whatever, that seemed to be at least something with a clear function that could be helpful at times. There's been reports of bribery by Taliban, Qataris, whoever, of the Afghan officials and military echelons for months. Uh, there's no doubt that intelligence assessment, whether by the U.S. intelligence or our allies, would have prompted Biden to pay attention to these developments and to see what was going on. Perhaps the administration wanted the Taliban in power because it almost seems like everything it's done was almost created to empower one actor against the rest. There's been no resources to other competing factions, no assistance whatsoever to the Northern Alliance to empower them and to create a balance of power in the event of U.S. withdrawal. It was almost like U.S. part of the U.S. deal with Taliban was that they would grab all the power, and we had to have known that that would happen unless we backed some of the other opposition resistance and so forth. We saw the fact that there were clear signals from US officials on the ground that the situation was rapidly deteriorating, and yet at the same time, Biden was claiming that everything was all right and the Taliban was not going to take Kabul and so forth. That was an outright lie. He had to have received that information. Giving over biometric data to Taliban, giving them lists of Americans and allies. Why? That was not necessary under any circumstances. In particular, when dealing with a violent extremist organization, treating them as a legitimate partner when we don't accord that status even to state actors that are
Right.
far less violent. Why would we do something like that? You can't say that it was just an emotional, thing. Denying entry to Americans and allies, evacuating long before even the deadline, rushing the process, creating a situation where people are literally trapped in different parts of the country and can't get through to the airport, refusing to clear the way for them to be able to get back home, and then claiming that they simply didn't want to go when they were clearly tied up, maybe with family members and so forth. None of it seems to me like simple ignorance of the situation. It seems to me like a pursuit of a particular policy where we are being fed false information about what's really going on. and why.
Do you think Americans understand that? And I'll go back all the way, just as an object lesson, the, if you will, the Kuwaiti invasion, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, based on mixed and missed signals by the United States State Department, which seemed to give tacit approval. Do you think Americans have a clear enough understanding of the type of messaging that occurs between nation states and the impact of that, these throwaway lines like from a Donald Trump, or these missed signals or intentionally missed signals, or these intentional confusion in terms of support and tacit endorsement given by an incompetent Biden administration? Do you think Americans really understand how important that is?
No, because for the past 10, 15, 20 years, Americans have been fed fantasy lines about how the world outside the US borders really works. And they've come to believe in a very simplistic vision of reality. And whether you're talking about leftists, conservatives, libertarians, or everyone in the middle, none of them seem to have a very informed and deep long-term thinking about the process of forming foreign relations. I think there's a fantasy about either the US just randomly being able to respond to every issue on the basis of ideology and emotions, which is, you know, unfortunately also reflected in our domestic policy. Or, on the other hand, that the US can simply stop being engaged in world affairs and live like they used to live in the 18th century, which is impossible, unrealistic. We don't live in that world anymore, nor is it really desirable, to be honest. But both of these binary visions of reality are unhelpful, counterproductive, and cause people to miss obvious cues that to everyone who is not on the level of basically kindergarten approach to life would be able to manage. Well, if you say that you're, you know, not going to back your ally, how is that ally going to perceive you, and what kind of assistance can you count on in the future? How are they going to relate to you, to your enemies, to and to other players in this scenario? These are the sorts of things that are fairly obvious, but if you are conditioned, literally conditioned, to believe that no matter what you do, it's going to be okay, because you don't need anybody, or somehow the situation will resolve itself, or you know you're so powerful that nobody is ever going to stop you. That's, if you're fed this sort of fairy tales, of course you're going to miss the obvious, or misinterpret it, or dismiss it.
Well, but one of the primary purposes of this show is to disabuse Americans of, as you put it, that simple binary approach to, if you will, to life. Life in a world filled with complex actors who are neither bad nor good actors and cannot be portrayed in that sort of simplistic, they're with us or they're against us, they're the evildoers or they're part of our, if you will, part of the assets that we seem to take for granted. That's what I'm hoping that you can shed a light on it for us and bring to us on a weekly basis or whenever possible, so that Americans can actually, maybe through the guise of the independent media and all the work that you do, and before you go, we're going to give you a chance, of course, to explain where folks can find all of your work on a variety of sources. But I would be amiss if there was one area that I feel like I'd love to have you bring us up to date, if to a certain degree, quickly. That's an American conceit right there. Just bring us up to date on the Khashoggi trials and tribulations simply and quickly, as if that can be easily done. So I apologize for that. But if you could touch on the Khashoggi murder and some of the ongoing, if you will, aftershocks, after events, if you can bring us a little bit up to speed on that.
All right, so just to summarize the situation, and I realize what I'm going to say will sound extremely controversial in light of the overwhelming um, and largely one-sided presentation of the story by the media, NGOs, political actors, and so forth. Khashoggi murder was an act of information warfare, which is strange, but it was literally a political operation aimed at two things: shutting up Khashoggi himself, who became a threat to certain actors, and framing the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who was also a threat to these same actors and more, for various reasons. I'm simplifying all of this. Who
Hmm.
would some of those people be? The old guard, people benefiting from previous security, financial, corrupt arrangements between Saudi Arabia, US, Europe, and so forth, intelligence agencies. Not, I would say members of agency. I wouldn't say entire intelligence agencies acting, that's conspiratorial thinking, but certain elements of intelligence agencies, maybe even dominant elements in in some aspects. Of course, Qatar and Turkish intelligence and so forth. All of these actors had a stake in the situation, and all of them benefited from certain conditions on the ground. Khashoggi was not a journalist in that sense of the word. He was a government censor who shut down journalists in Saudi Arabia. He was a political actor, an operative, an intelligence officer who had the reputation for torturing people. We should not idealize him. I don't personally support extrajudicial killings. I believe such people should stand trial and face public justice. But this was not a case of an execution gone wrong. It was a case of someone being shut down in the midst of an operation that did not go wrong. It went right. It was extremely successful. It was planned by people with a great deal of intelligence experience, and it worked wonders. And there was a lot of money and resources invested in the information warfare campaign that followed, exacerbated it, and then distracted people from the real story at hand. Khashoggi was in the midst of planning that very same operation when he met his end. He did not realize that he was the bait. He was developing a particular campaign that sought to portray the crown prince as a pursuer of Saudi opposition around the world by means of Israeli surveillance software, as well as by means of a squad of assassins who traveled from country to country, intimidating and abducting people. That was the concept that was being delivered by Khashoggi and other people. And Khashoggi was independently pursuing his own goals. He was selling intelligence information to various countries. He was going around asking for funding for various projects without coordinating with his backers inside Saudi Arabia and other states, Islamists and old guard people and people who affiliated with particular interests who were backing him for specific reasons. And he essentially went rogue on his backers, and he met his end as bait, unaware that he was the person that they were hunting. And we saw that following his death, these same interests continued to pursue this goal by coming up with normally implausible stories. It is implausible that trained intelligence operatives would go would travel together without any fake names, without any clandestine measures, that they would all ignore the cameras on the consulate, enter without searching and swiping for bugs from the Turkish intelligence that were clearly planted there, and proceed to attack Khashoggi and dismember him for no reason at all. And he was supposedly unsuspecting a trained intelligence operative who went once into the consulate. For what purpose? If he was there to just get paperwork, why didn't his fiancee go with him? All these questions point to the elaborate planning of the operation that was executed well. It was executed exactly as it should. And the psychological element was particularly successful in that most media and most people did not ask those questions. That top someone with some familiarity in the area would jump out in the beginning. The first question would be to ask who's Khashoggi, why he so important. There's a million people criticizing the crown prince around the world. Not all of them are dead. Nothing happens to them whatsoever. So why this guy? What's so special about him? So um, that's basically the long and the short of it. Some of the myths about him took root through sheer amount of investment, stereotyping about Saudis, and all sorts of propaganda that took place. The
Wow.
the investment rivals anything that the Soviet Union has ever done to smear its enemies. It was an exceptionally successful story. Many people have learned to idolize Khashoggi as some sort of a symbol of press freedom. In reality, he stood in every way against free speech and free press. He threatened a Saudi scholar who criticized him prior to these events and criticized his affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood itself is a grassroots but not a democratic organization, neither in its structure nor in its ideology or function. He was somebody who was extremely critical of any Saudi peace efforts towards Israel and sought to disrupt those.
Wow.
He was someone. So this is someone who stood against freedom of speech in every way and everything he believed in, and making him into a symbol of journalistic oppression. When he was himself a supporter of Erdogan, the number one jailer of journalists, is extremely ironic, in my opinion.
Wow. A subject for another show is clearly the involvement of the international media in hiring, conspiring. Because his front, if you will, from an American's perspective, that this was an honored journalist and a member of the Washington Post. Uh, you're giving us a completely different insight.
Not only was he not really a journalist for the Washington Post, he was barely a columnist. His
Right.
columns were written by Qataris, and he basically copied and pasted them, and Washington Post admitted as much. He was a foreign agent, and he was upper. By the way, this is someone who came to the U.S. not as an asylum seeker. He never sought asylum. If he was so afraid of MBS, why did he not seek protective measures?
Yeah. No. I'm guilty of the oversimplified American narrative, which is why when I had the opportunity to chat with you for the first time a few weeks ago, that I said this is there needs to be sources of additional insight into complex, multiple actor, multiple country, multiple philosophies, because again, the American public is essentially at the end of a journalistic food chain that is more intent these days on amplifying the narrative of their hero and defining their opposition as bogeymen than they are giving us anything akin to the sort of geopolitical insight you're able to give us. Well, we're going to try and do. There might be times when we have to do replays because of your travel, but we're going to try and do this every week at about 9:15 on Tuesday nights. Gives us the opportunity to be heard on the West Coast and around the world. I'm very excited about this. I know you do a lot of work with conferences and teleconferences, and when and wherever possible where we can host or at least share them, we want to. I know if maybe you can tease us a little bit on your first full episode, if you will, which will be at the same time next week. Can you give us a little tease about the style of guest that you're going to have
Sure,
on and the conversation you're thinking about?
sure. So I'll introduce the subject of conversation. My guests have been invited. One of them just needs to clear it with his job, so I just want to make sure that it's 100% confirmed before naming him. but the subject will be I'll be starting the discussion about the role of Qatar in information warfare, and I will begin by discussing Qatar's role in Afghanistan in Afghanistan related events. The defense secretary just praised the emir for his role in providing assistance for the refugees crisis. But should emir be praised for a problem that may be at least partially of Qatar's own creation?
Right. Wow.
So that's going to be the setup, and possibly if if I can do it in that one episode, I'll bring in the domestic angle of Qatar's interventionism and foreign influence campaigns in the U.S. If not, then it's going to be a separate episode at some point in the future.
Excellent. Well, it's great to work alongside you. We're thrilled that you're willing to invest time into our platform here, and I I look forward to this. I can't tell you how excited I am to work alongside with you. We've already gotten to meet virtually, if you will, a number of the folks who are both contributors to you and supporters of your work just through our Twitter. And we'll be sharing this, and folks will be able to watch live on YouTube, live on Twitter, and of course live on Facebook, understanding that different parts of the world just source their media and their platforms differently. And we're going to be open to any platform where we can get a greater audience for you worldwide. So, you know, when folks listen to this over the next day or so in the run-up to your first full show, we are certainly open to suggestions as to media platforms and ways to amplify your message and the message of your guests. So, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity. And I'm very excited to join next week with my guests and to continue exploring challenging, controversial, hot button issues, and hopefully arrive at answers that are not simple but are long term and enduring.
Excellent. Irina Zuckerman, she of course is of the Washington Outsider. Scarab Rising is her own, if you will, consulting / security firm. She's a lawyer trained at American law schools, but someone who clearly brings her trade, her analysis, her wit, her academic prowess to an entire planet. And you know, again, this hold on tight, folks. This is going to be a bumpy ride.